The telegraph line to the city goes dead just after 8 in the morning. The radio station stops transmitting. At Army headquarters in the capital, operators try the connection again and get nothing back. Reports arrive from towns nearby, and by every account, they are chaotic. Something has happened in a city of a few 100,000 people, and no one in the capital can say what. Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is August 6th. The weapon that severed those lines began as a letter. In August 1939, refugee physicists in the United States persuaded Albert Einstein to sign a warning to President Roosevelt. Uranium might be made into an extremely powerful bomb, it said, and Germany had halted uranium exports from mines it now controlled in Czechoslovakia. Washington moved slowly. The catalyst for change came from Britain, where in 1940, two physicists at Birmingham calculated that such a bomb might require only kilograms of a rare uranium isotope rather than tons. That turned a theoretical curiosity into an engineering problem with a major budget. By late 1942, the American program had an Army engineer running it, General Leslie Groves, and one hard result to show. That December, beneath the stands of a football stadium at the University of Chicago, a pile of graphite and uranium assembled by the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi sustained the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. What followed was less a laboratory than an industrial empire. Enrichment plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, separated uranium-235 by 3 competing methods because no one knew which would work. Reactors at Hanford in Washington state manufactured plutonium, an element first isolated in a weighable sample only in 1942. The cost reached roughly $2 billion. At peak, the effort employed well over 100,000 people, almost none of whom knew what they were building. The two materials demanded two designs. Uranium could be assembled by firing one subcritical piece into another down a gun barrel, a method so straightforward that the physicists at Los Alamos, under Robert Oppenheimer, never tested it. Plutonium could not. Measurements in 1944 showed that reactor-bred plutonium carried an isotope prone to spontaneous fission, which would make a gun-type weapon tear itself apart before it fully reacted. The alternative was implosion, crushing a plutonium sphere inward with explosive lenses timed to microseconds. That design was uncertain enough to require a test. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, it released energy equivalent to more than 20,000 tons of TNT. Germany had surrendered 10 weeks earlier. The argument that launched the project no longer applied, and some scientists said so. A group at Chicago proposed in June that the weapon first be demonstrated on empty ground. The government's scientific advisory panel weighed that option and reported it could see no acceptable alternative to direct military use. A demonstration that failed would stiffen Japanese resolve, and the United States only had enough material for a handful of weapons. One figure attached to the decision afterward deserves scrutiny. The claim that invading Japan would have cost 1 million American lives spread through post-war memoirs. The planning documents from June 1945 carried far smaller numbers. One Joint Staff estimate projected on the order of 190,000 American casualties across both phases of the invasion, with deaths a fraction of that. The million figure reached Truman from Herbert Hoover, not from his planners, and the Army told him it was far too high. Target selection followed its own logic. Planners wanted cities large enough to display the weapon's full effect and intact enough to measure it, which ruled out places already gutted by the firebombing campaign that had burned much of urban Japan. Secretary of War Henry Stimson personally struck Kyoto from the list over Grove's objections. The remaining candidates were then pulled from the conventional bombing schedule and deliberately left alone. Hiroshima's survival through the spring of 1945 was partly due to preservation. The city had military standing to justify the choice. It held the headquarters of the 2nd General Army, which commanded the defense of parts of western and southern Japan, along with a port of embarkation, a garrison, and supply depots. It was also a city of civilians, built largely of wood, spread flat across a river delta and ringed by hills that planners expected would hold the blast in rather than break it. On July 26th, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding surrender and promising prompt and utter destruction otherwise. It mentioned no new weapon. Japan's prime minister told reporters his government would meet the declaration with silence, though the surrounding records suggest Tokyo was not prepared to accept the terms regardless. The 509th Composite Group, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, had trained for the better part of a year without being told what it was training for. Tinian sat in the Marianas, some 1,500 miles from Japan. The weapon loaded there weighed nearly 5 tons and was called Little Boy. Inside sat roughly 60 kilograms of enriched uranium, the output of 2 years of industrial separation. Less than a kilogram of it would actually fission. 3 aircraft lifted off minutes apart, starting at 2:45 in the morning on August 6th. A Navy ordnance officer, William Parsons, completed the weapon's arming in flight rather than on the ground, because heavily loaded B-29s had recently crashed on takeoff from that runway. Ahead of them, weather planes checked the 3 candidate cities. The one over Hiroshima radioed back that the clouds were thin. An air raid alert had sounded at Hiroshima just after 7 and been lifted 20 minutes later. When radar picked up a small number of aircraft approaching, many people stayed where they were. It was the start of a working day. Thousands of schoolchildren were outdoors in the city center, mobilized to demolish wooden houses and clear fire breaks against the conventional raids everyone expected. The bomb was released at 8:15 from about 31,000 feet. It fell for 43 seconds and detonated roughly 1,900 feet above the ground, several hundred feet from the T-shaped bridge the bombardier had aimed at. Ground temperatures beneath the burst reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a radius of about half a mile, almost nothing that was alive survived. The blast wave collapsed the wooden city outward. Roughly 7 of every 10 buildings were destroyed or burned. Fires merged into a firestorm within 20 to 30 minutes, consuming over 4 square miles. Then, in the north and west, a heavy black rain fell, thick with soot and fission products. Estimates of the dead that day run between 70 and 80,000. By the end of 1945, the figure had reached roughly 140,000, and even that carries a margin of 10,000 in either direction, because the records of the people who kept records had burned along with them. Among the dead were thousands of Koreans, many of them brought to Japan as forced laborers, and 12 American prisoners of war. The 2nd General Army Headquarters was effectively erased. The city could not treat itself. 9 in 10 of Hiroshima's doctors and nurses were killed or injured, and 42 of its 45 hospitals were rendered unusable. In the following days and weeks, people who had walked away without visible wounds began losing their hair, bleeding from the gums, and dying of infections their bodies could no longer fight. In Tokyo, an officer was dispatched by air to find out what had happened. He saw the smoke long before he reached the city. 16 hours after the detonation, Truman's prepared statement was released, announcing an atomic bomb and warning of a rain of ruin from the air. The question in Tokyo was no longer only what had destroyed Hiroshima, but whether the Americans had more. They had won. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war, and within hours, sent roughly 1.5 million troops into Japanese-held Manchuria, ending any hope of a negotiated peace brokered through Moscow. On August 9th, a second aircraft found its primary target of Kokura obscured by haze and smoke and turned to Nagasaki. The plutonium implosion weapon detonated at 2 minutes past 11, off target, over a valley whose surrounding hills confined the destruction. Roughly 40,000 people died immediately, and about 70,000 by year's end. The Emperor of Japan intervened twice, on August 10th and again on August 14th, and junior officers attempted a coup that night to stop the surrender broadcast. It failed. On August 15th, most Japanese heard his voice for the first time, telling him the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd aboard a battleship in Tokyo Bay. The dying did not stop with the war. Japanese researchers later placed the total near 200,000 by 1950, as radiation-related illness and cancers accumulated. Survivors faced decades of discrimination over illnesses no one could see. Their bodies also became the world's principal dataset, a long-term health study that followed 90,000 survivors alongside a matched group who were not exposed, begun under American occupation and still running, remains the foundation of radiation exposure science. No nuclear weapon has been used in war in the 81 years since. Nearly every safety limit on radiation exposure in use today, from nuclear plants to medical scanners, rests on what became of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who were walking to work on 2 clear summer mornings. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.